Um, my name is Indrup, and today I want to take the class on bar graph. I find the bar graph to be very easy, and a lot of my students are afraid of it. I don't know why, but it's easy because it gives you a lot of scope for comparisons, and there are things that you can do with bar graph that you probably can't do with other graphs in the sense of language, in the sense of comparisons. So today I'll be covering all of that. So I'll tell you the steps that I follow when I write a bar graph, and then we'll discuss a sample answer. So for today's class, I've taken this bar graph. It's one of the exam questions that came in the exam a few years ago. So the first thing that I do, the first step is to read the question and to understand the graph. So here I look at the question. It says the graph below shows the average class size in 6 countries and compares it with the world average class size in 2006. So let me just give you an idea about what I undertook, what I got from the question. So first 2006, meaning the data is from past. So I have to write it in the past tense. Then average class size. I know average class size means what? The number of students. When I looked at the graph, it shows that there is a primary school and there's a lower secondary. So they've divided into two halves, and they've compared between primary school and lower secondary school. And then they've given 6 countries, and then they have also given the world average. So compares it with the world average doesn't, it's not that important. It's just another data. It's an average of the world class size. So I'm pretty sure I understood all the graph. So I'm pretty confident about it. So the second step that I do is I write the introduction. Here I won't think anything else. I just write the introduction down because I feel like if I don't, I waste a lot of time. So I just pick up the introduction and I make an introduction. Like my mother told you in the process graph, we don't waste a lot of time in writing the introduction. It's a quick thing. So I just paraphrase it in the to the best of my capabilities. I don't focus on vocabulary, and I think you shouldn't. After I'm done with the introduction, I now plan my overall and my body paragraphs. Now, for the bar graph especially, you should read the second line. A lot of students don't read this line. Summarize the information by selecting and reporting the main points and give comparisons where relevant. So they don't focus on this, and I think that's really important. So you have to report the main points and give comparisons too. So we have to do that. So when I look at the bar graph, I try to find out the number of comparisons possible. So let's look at this graph and see the number of comparisons possible. If you can see, there are two types of comparison possible. One is um, in between the countries, like you can compare the different countries with each other. For example, South Korea with Japan, with UK, with Denmark, with Mexico, with Iceland, and then also the world average. And the second type of comparison you can do is within the same country, you can compare the primary school size and the lower secondary school size. So it's very important to cover both of these comparisons in the graph if you want to score high. So now I'll plan my overall. So the thing with comparisons is if you try to give both the comparisons together, you try and you most of my students mess up. Even I sometimes mess up. So I try to separate them. So what I do is I give one of the comparisons in the overall and I keep the second comparison for the body paragraph. So what do I mean by that? Let me give you an idea. So there are two types of comparison, the between the countries and between the primary school and the lower secondary school in the same country. Okay, so what I'll do is I'll compare the countries first and I'll see what I can find out. So if I compare the countries, you see that South Korea had the highest class size in both for both primary school and lower secondary school. So that is something that's something like a comparison between the countries. And also I can see that Iceland had the least for both primary and lower secondary schools. So that is also something that I can keep for the overall. This is one type of comparison, and I'm going to keep it for my overall. So I'll leave my overall for this much for now. But if you have any more comparisons, if there are more than two comparisons, you can also mention them in the overall. So I'll come to that later. But now let me go to the body paragraph approach. So what happens in the body paragraph is, most of my students just start writing. They pick up a random country, or they pick up the country with the highest data, and they just start writing. The problem with that is, what do you do for the after that? So for example, you picked South Korea, and then what? Then you're going to do what? Move on to Japan. Okay, that's the second highest. But then what? Who's the third highest? Are you going to go to that? Are you going to talk about primary school? Are you going to talk about secondary school? So this results in a lot of confusion. So remember, we also discussed there's another type of comparison between primary school and lower secondary. What I do is I focus on that comparison in the body paragraphs. So I'll take the primary school class size and compare it with the lower secondary school class size. So if you look at the data, if you can see my cursor, see the countries: South Korea, Japan, Mexico, Iceland. All of these countries have a um, lower class size in primary schools than like lower secondary schools. Whereas in UK and Denmark, the opposite is true. The school size of class size of primary school is greater than the lower secondary school. And the same thing is true for the world average too. So now I'll make my body paragraphs like that. Because if I don't do that, it will just come off as like um, just plain data, and I don't want to do that. I want to make it interesting to read. So how will I start? I'll start by, you can start by saying the class size of South Korea, the primary school class size in South Korea was this. And what I'll write in the second line is, and the lower secondary school class size was a slightly higher at 36 or 37. If you can see that, 34 and around 37. So now what I'll do is I'll say similarly for Japan, Mexico, and Iceland, the class size for primary school is slightly less than the lower secondary school, and then I'll give their data. So what this approach allowed me is, first of all, allowed me to use a word similarly, and then it allowed me to give the data. It made the graph interesting to read. For example, if a person reads it, he will know he got some trend out of it. Um, then I'll do what? I'll go to the next paragraph and I'll start off by saying on the other hand, because now I'm talking about UK and Denmark, and their lower secondary class size is greater than primary school. Their primary school class size is greater than lower secondary. The problem here that though happens is students write the connector, but they don't explain why they have used the connector. For example, when I was using on the other hand, I just now told you why I'm writing on the other hand. So the line would come like this: on the other hand, in these countries, the primary school class size is greater than the secondary school class size, and then I'll give their data, and then finally I'll mention the world average too. The world average for primary school is this, and it's slightly higher than the lower secondary school class size at this. Okay, now you've looked at all that. So now the thing is, this is a good enough graph, but it's still not worth 9 bands, or still not worth. I think it's worth 8 bands, probably 7.5, 8 bands, but it's not worth 9 bands. And the reason for that is your overall should be more than just one comparison. It should have more than one trend. So I'll go back to the overall and I'll see anything else that I can mention. So there are things you can do in the overall. You can have a second thing, like besides the highest and the lowest. So you can mention um, these all countries, for example, South Korea, Japan. These all have a greater class size than the world average, and the other countries have a lesser class size than the world average. You can write something like that. You can talk about Mexico, that the largest difference between the primary school class size and secondary school class size was observed in Mexico. So you can write anything like that. Just to have an overall that's just not one comparison. That's just more than one comparison. That's more than one trend. So it's about writing the main themes. Bring the sample answer for the same graph. I'll go step by step and mention what I've done. I've underlined some things in the graph and I want to tell you why I've done that. So when we come to that, I'll be also clarifying that. So the first step is to read the question and look at the graph, understand it, and write the introduction. If you can add anything from the graph to the question, do that. So the introduction looks complete. For example, here I've added the country names, and I've also mentioned the primary school and lower secondary school class sizes given, so that it makes my graph look more complete. Uh, After you've written the introduction, you should look at the number of comparisons possible. Again, I'm going to repeat that there are two comparisons possible: the comparison between the primary school class size and lower secondary school class size, and the comparison between different countries. So if you want to score marks, both the comparisons have to be done. But if I try to do both the comparisons at the same place, normally what happens is I end up getting confused, and you might too. So do what? Make reserve one comparison for the overall and one for the body paragraph. Here I've mentioned the country comparison in the overall. So I've written overall South Korea had the largest while Iceland had the least class size. And because I like I told you earlier, if you can find some more trend to mention in the overall, do that. Something more important. For example, Mexico had the largest difference in class size, if you can see this, and I've mentioned that in the overall as well. Now coming to my body paragraphs, I'm doing the other comparison between primary school and secondary school. So my whole graph is based on this comparison now. The first paragraph is going to be about the countries in which the primary school class size is less than the lower secondary school class size, and the second paragraph is going to be about the countries in which the uh, primary school class size is greater than the lower secondary school class size. So I've taken South Korea, Japan, Mexico and Iceland in the first paragraph, and UK and Denmark and the world average in the second body paragraph. So first I give the data for South Korea, then I say similarly in Japan and Mexico and Iceland also the same trend can be seen. So this is the way I've done. If you can see my connectors, I've written the connectors similarly here because I want to say the same trend is being followed. But a mistake that some of my students do is they don't explain their connector. For example, they might understand in their head why they're using similarly, but the examiner also has to be told that. So after writing similarly, do tell, like for example, the primary school class size was lesser than the lower secondary class size in these countries as well. So that's what I've done. Then you give the data for these countries, and finally you can cover the data for the last country, that's Mexico. After you're done with this, you start the second paragraph. You can use a connector here again because the whole paragraph, the first one was about the countries with one thing. Now the second paragraph is about countries with the other thing. So you can start off by on the other hand. But again, you have to explain to the examiner why you have used it. And that's what I've done here. Then I've given the data for the countries UK, and finally I've given the data for the world average. If you look at some of my connectors, I've written while is for comparison, however is for comparison, whereas is for comparison. Also is an additional fact, it's not a comparison with the first line. So these are the connectors that I've used. I've also used finally, like I told you earlier. One thing I'll like to mention, because some of my students face this problem, they don't understand the difference between however and while. They are interreplaceable in many areas, but with while, the comparison has to end within the same sentence. But in the case of while, the comparison can be with a different sentence. For example, I can make a whole sentence and then say B does that. So however B does that. So A does this, however B does this. So now this line is a comparison with the first sentence. Whereas in the case of while, the comparison has to be in the same sentence. For example, while A does that, B does that. It cannot be like a comparison with the previous line. I hope you understood that, because it's a bit tricky at first, but it's really easy after you understand it. If you didn't, you can ask in the comment section as well. So this is the whole approach. After you've read your whole, after you've written down the whole graph, please reread it again once or twice. That's really necessary. Even the best of the best people make mistakes. So that's the approach for the whole graph. I hope you liked it, and if you liked it, please do subscribe and like the video, and post in the comment section which video you would like us to cover next. Thank you.